First of all, let's start off with this ding-dong between Victoria and Canberra at the moment. What's your view of what's going on?
There's a lot to cover there, Pete. Good morning. Look, across the country, there's ding-dongs over the border closures. Obviously, whether or not ADF personnel were offered or not in Victoria. You've got court cases all over the place. There's obviously the Commonwealth's responsibility with respect to aged care. And the broader economic malaise as well. So, look, there's a lot to get through there.
Yeah.
I suppose, I think what's starting to really fray, unfortunately, is that national cabinet solidarity, which worked really well with the first outbreak. I think with the secondary outbreaks, we're really starting to see that fray, which I think is really disappointing, because I actually think the focus and attention of decision makers right now needs to be on arresting what's happening in Victoria in particular. Let's get those numbers down, let's get the pressure off the health system, and let's get the economy rebooted and going again, rather than going over and over again about who did what when it comes to these historical battles that we're seeing in the paper every day.
But it does seem to me, I mean, just going off what I can gather and what I can read, it does seem to me that Defence Force help was offered by the federal government and wasn't accepted in the end by the state government in Victoria.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews says today in response to that. An interesting leak that's in today's papers in terms of timeline and internal communications from Defence Force personnel. I suppose one of the difficult things is when you have these emergency situations, Pete, is the lines of accountability between state governments and federal governments, and sometimes messages can get lost. I think in some of those reports I see today that it has ADF going back to superiors saying that it seemed like Victorian police had preparations well in advance when it came to handling hotel quarantine. Now, obviously, that didn't really end up really well. We know that it's a matter of fact, and I think the Victorian government's accepted responsibility there, and we'll see what happens at the end of the inquiry that they have going there too. I think really we should be focusing on, how do we get those numbers down? They're still well over 400 a day. We really want to get those numbers down. I think that's what would really be frustrating for people in Victoria, having to live with these lockdowns going on and on.
Yeah, interesting too. When it comes to the other big major crisis in New South Wales, that was the Ruby Princess, and the report into that inquiry comes out tomorrow, and I think the government's going to come in for a fair bit of scrutiny when it comes to that, for sure.
Well, that's right, Pete, and that's why it's really messy across the board. We know, and we've got the Commonwealth making some pretty serious attempts to stop its officials appearing before that Ruby Princess inquiry. So, there's Commonwealth and state responsibility all through this, through different aspects of this pandemic. And we know the Commonwealth, and we know that there's certain actions in New South Wales and Victoria which unfortunately haven't lived up to par and have disappointed us. That's fine. I think the time for going back and working out who did what and what went wrong is not necessarily right now. It's about focusing on the pandemic, these secondary outbreaks, and how we can get the economy rebooted. We're not really having enough of that discussion because, as we see more data out today, Pete, with unemployment, this economic crisis is going to be with us for a long, long time.
OK, well, we do have some breaking news just into us, James. The numbers that have come out from Victoria today, 278 cases. That's the lowest it's been for a while in terms of new infections of COVID-19. 278, and it's also, unfortunately, 8 people who've lost their lives. Victoria hasn't had much to be positive about in recent times, but there is, something. It seems to be heading in the right direction now anyway, 278 cases today. Meanwhile, well, what's your thoughts on that, James?
Yeah, no, I think that's. I mean, look, it's fantastic. I mean, it's a bit weird.
Well, not fantastic. Yeah, when you're talking about people dying.
We're talking about a big number, aren't we? Of course, exactly. But the fact is, you're right. It's heading in the right direction. We know there's going to be a big tail when it comes to these serious cases from those big numbers being experienced over the last month or so. Unfortunately, that's going to mean continued deaths, particularly in aged care facilities. We'll see that play out. That's just going to be a fact in dealing with the pandemic. But the bottom line is the lockdown's obviously starting to have an impact, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and you did bring up aged care because there's been a heck of a week with all the new revelations that have come out as a result of that Royal Commission. What's your view of what's gone on? I mean, the federal government has said, it was well prepared, and it is a federal government issue, this one. It was well prepared, but the Commission had said, it wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's right. That's why I think it gets a bit silly, Pete, when governments start attacking each other, because we all know they've got different rights and responsibilities when it comes to handling the pandemic, and they've all been found wanting in different areas. But let's just focus on getting through this, and then we can work out later on what happened. Absolutely, in extraordinary scenes yesterday, we had Dr Murphy, who's now the Secretary of the Health Department, basically intervening into the Royal Commission for Aged Care. I mean, whether or not the federal government learnt the lessons and the department learnt the lessons from the Dorothy Hendon Lodge case, and that evidence was before these secondary outbreaks occurred in Victoria. I think the federal government has been wanting there, but I also think that other governments have been found wanting too with aspects here, and there's definitely going to need to be a thorough review, like probably a Royal Commission into the whole handling of the pandemic, but that's not really a discussion and debate for today. That's next year, and once we get through this, and then we can work out a proper national protocol for how we deal with these significant events in the future.
What about these comments from the Trade Minister and the Tourism Minister as well, Simon Birmingham? He's kind of basically saying that the states have got to stump up more cash. So there's a bit of a threat coming there, and this comes off the back of Josh Frydenberg hinting that he wants the states to start chipping in more money as well.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's just another sign, Pete, that National Cabinet process and structure is fraying a little bit. States are obviously looking after their health systems, and they can see these the secondary outbreaks in Victoria, wanting to make sure that they're protecting their health systems from that as well, and that's very understandable. Now, we know that has business impacts, and that flows on to the states, but also to the Commonwealth. I think it's a bit disappointing now that we're getting into this rolling argy-bargy between the feds and the states. I think the Commonwealth's got with its fiscal might, will have a continued role to play in supporting states get through it and supporting businesses in continuing to deploy the next phases of stimulus. I mean, I think we're just going to have to see more announcements in the next months. We've got an October budget as well that continues to support business as well. So, you know, we need to have Commonwealth and states, you know, using that National Cabinet process to continue to work together, not against each other.